Okay, welcome to anybody who's watching this. I actually have a very special guest with me today, someone I'm really excited to talk about. It's Lance Shaner, the founder and owner of Omega Yeast, who you probably will have heard of. I don't know, Lance, how you'd describe yourself. Would you say you're specialist yeast lab or?
I would call us all-purpose, I suppose. I mean, just because we have historically done a lot of research into new strains, so that would be kind of the specialist part of it. But we, propagate all the kind of the traditional strains that brewers have expected to, and do lab services. So we're kind of all-purpose.
Right, and maybe we should start with just what is the background? Like, how did you found Omega? What's your background? Is it coming from a brewing, from a lab, from?
Yeah, my interest in beer started in college, as it does for a lot of people. So one of my roommates and I got interested in home brewing and joined a homebrew club at the University of Illinois. It was actually at that time an official university sanctioned club. So they actually had a booth on Quad Day and whatnot. But I've learned since that they don't do that anymore. I guess the association of a university with a club whose purpose is making and drinking beer gave somebody the willies. So the club still exists, but it's not a university club. But that was my introduction into making beer and working with yeast and just getting interested in the process. And I did microbiology as an undergrad. So that's what kindled everything. And then went to graduate school where I ended up studying yeast. That wasn't actually even my intention going there, but I ended up doing one of my rotations through a lab studying yeast, and it was more in the human health context, but still it was a lot of hands-on with yeast, and continued to make beer that way. Then we're going to have to skip forward a little bit. So I actually took a detour to law school, ended up being a patent attorney, a biotechnology patent attorney for 4 years after I got my JD and PhD. So then we get to where I had just kind of a chance conversation with one of my colleagues at the firm who was a partner in a venture starting a craft brewery in the Chicago area. So we were just at an event and talking about his thing and where he was going to be getting his yeast. And it was literally that conversation that sparked the idea to start Omega Yeast, because there was nobody else in the Midwest even doing it. And, there are no liquid yeast providers. There's a couple out west, one in the Rocky Mountains, and that was it at the time. So we started out just providing locally in Chicago. There were, it was a really rapidly growing beer scene. This would have been around 2013. So there was just enough locally that we thought we could get off the ground by serving just local breweries and grow from there. And we've grown from there to be international at this point.
Right. And was that, I suppose we can get around later to the actual types of yeast, but like, was that kind of, you were selling just standard regular yeast? There was nothing different in theory about your yeast. I mean, we can talk about how you propagate it later, but
I would say at the start, I mean, there was a difference in the way we did things. Like some of the other existing labs would essentially make large batches of it, and kind of divvy it out and then sell it as it was ordered. So it might take them a month or 2 months to sell it. So some people are getting 2-month-old yeast, whereas we, right from the start, our goal was to produce fresh yeast made to order. So we couldn't ship it immediately, but our process is fast, so we could ship a fresh pitch out within a week of receiving the order. And the brewer knows every time it's going to be fresh and made for them, and they get very consistent results that way. So that our process kind of differentiated us from the start compared to what was available.
Right. And is that still differentiating? Yeah. I mean, I take it you're not the only people who are doing that now, but you're one of the few.
One of the few, for sure. I mean, I think maybe there's like one other lab in the U.S. that kind of does it similarly, but yeah, that's still differentiating. And I think one of the reasons why we've had some success is that people have consistent results because our yeast is fresh.
Right. Yeah, it makes sense. So I guess one of the things I have is, about that. I mean, if you have, I don't know how I'm going to phrase this. Yeah, if you have that kind of standard, for lack of a better word, standard yeast. I mean, where does the lab come into this? I'm always curious for this because the brewers themselves, obviously, when they use the yeast, they produce more of it than they started with. So where do the brewers? I guess I'm interested in why more brewers don't kind of use the yeast harvested and use it themselves.
Oh,
Where the advantages of a yeast
they very
lab?
much do. I mean, a lot of times it's their goal to stretch it out as far as they can. So, they might, but it depends on the brewery and the types of beers they're brewing. Some styles just aren't very amenable to having a good crop at the end. So they might have to come back more frequently to get a fresh pitch. But generally speaking, if they're brewing, kind of, blonde ales that aren't heavily dry hopped, like they'll take it out 8 to 10 generations before they'll, come back to the lab to start again. So, I mean, we're not selling, with some exceptions, a fresh pitch for every brew what our customers are doing. They are stretching it out.
Right. And if I'm right, I mean, the history of that goes back to Carlsberg, doesn't it? It's that they figured out how to isolate the yeast and they kind of keep the core batch. And I guess that's what you're doing. You have a core batch, do you? And then you kind of use as a starter and you create, but you have a frozen or fridge or whatever.
Exactly. So we have a frozen stock that essentially is, stuck in time. I mean, it's not changing. So every time they come back to us, they're going back to that original generation, which is where, I don't know, this is a kind of interesting philosophical topic too, because the reason we have such a wide variety of yeast strains right now is because that's not how it's always been done, right? Yeah. There's been serial repitching by the same brewery for decades and decades. And that yeast has changed. I mean, every time it reproduces, it makes errors in its genetics, and those errors lead to divergence of traits. So that's why we have all these yeast strains. But now that we have them, we've kind of adopted a different way of going about it, and we look for consistency, right? A brewer wants consistency in their product, and so if they are out 8 to 10 generations and they start to see things shifting, the flocculation's different, the ester output is different, they'll go back to the beginning and start again to have that consistent product.
Right, and that's when they come back to you then, because I presume then they don't keep their, or most breweries don't keep a frozen stock.
I mean, it requires, some know-how and some specialized equipment and all that stuff. And, they're trying to make beer rather than.
Okay. So I suppose that's what it comes down to. Yeah. That's not, keeping yeast isn't their speciality, isn't their expertise. Right. So that's what you're supposed to do. So, so you're producing it on demand, but you also sell to home brewers, but that's not on demand.
Right. So that's definitely, functions a little differently, where we do have to have more of a predictive model for, making enough that it's all going to go out the door as fresh as possible, because then it's going to go to a homebrew shop where it sits on the shelf until a home brewer picks it up. Unfortunately, there's just not a way to apply our brewery model with the home brewer. It's just not practical on that level. So, so it's definitely different there, where we have to do, a lot of predictive stuff and make just enough to have it going out as fresh as possible all the time.
Yeah, and you have a lot of strains. I mean, I don't know, I didn't count them, but I suppose you have about 40 strains there on your website, is it?
Yeah, on the homebrew side, it's probably in the neighborhood of 40 strains that we make available. The catalog available to pro brewers, I think, is probably around 80 strains now. But again, that's, we could have twice that and still manage, just because we're making it when they order it. But homebrew, that's why we have a more limited set for the homebrew side, because it gets unwieldy the more you get. And then we would have stuff just sitting on the shelf and getting old and serving nobody.
Yeah. Right. And that's, so I guess you see in advance, like, any trends coming down on what way beers are going, just because people are buying different yeast to try and, say, do a stout versus an IPA versus a sour of some sort.
I would definitely say our sales kind of reflect the trends. Just based on the strains. So lagers have, in the US, craft lager has been something that's probably grown a lot. Everything's still dominated by IPA and by hazy IPA in particular. But lagers have definitely grown. I don't know what that percentage is, but we definitely make more lager yeast now than we used to.
Right. Yeah. Okay. So I suppose the other thing, if we can come around to it, I mean, some of the yeast you have, the particular one that the reason I contacted you was the Yoviru one. Um,
Mhm.
you're the only people who have that. Am I right?
There, well, officially,
Yeah, this is another story I was hoping to bring in, but officially you're the only people who have. Like,
yes.
right.
So, yeah, and so Aldona had reached out to us, the brewer of Yoviru, and through the consulate in Philadelphia, which is, I mean, another kind of funny story because it's not every day that we're just a yeast lab. We don't expect to be contacted by any sort of like foreign consulate about yeast. So there's like the first reaction when they're reaching out to you is like, Rubian, like, is this some weird catfishing thing? like what's the angle here? But it just turned out that I think brewers and drinkers that had made their way through Yoviru had talked to Aldona about how the beer is unique, and she, I think, attributes that unique quality, at least in part, to the yeast that she uses, which have been kind of maintained. Like we're talking about maintaining yeast for generations. It's just been maintained internally by repitching for a long time. And people had said, you should make this available to people. And she was pretty protective of it. But reached, somehow this conversation then got transferred to the consulate. They reached out to us to see about making this yeast available more broadly. And Aldona gets a royalty for the sales. And I mean, IP is a little intellectual property is a little complicated around yeast. A naturally occurring yeast strain like that isn't something you can patent.
Right.
So Aldona doesn't really have the means or the legal standing to be able to sue other people that use her yeast. So she could have, some home brewer could have brought back some beer with them and harvested that yeast and traded it to whoever they want. There's nothing anybody can do about that. There's just no protections for that. And we recognize that too. I mean, a competitor could take a pack of Yoviru yeast and start selling it too. One of the protections we do have in intellectual property is trademark. So, we filed a trademark on behalf of Aldona. So she owns the trademark for Yoviru brewing yeast. So nobody else can sell something they're calling Yoviru brewing yeast. So that comes with some sort of advantage and protection, but the strain itself, there's just no means of protecting the strain itself.
Yeah, that's the part I was really curious about. I was trying to wrap my head around, like, how did the licensing work and the protection? Because I was there, I visited her summer before last, and that was when I started talking. She was mentioning yourselves, and yeah, she said that after she did the deal with yourself, there was some neighbor who sold his yeast under the same name, and it was very confused for a while or something. That
Yeah, and I think I do recall at some point there was a small, I think it was essentially like a garage operation in New England somewhere, calling it that, and we basically told them like, look, we've got Aldona has a trademark on this, you cannot call it that.
right, so
And they were actually pretty cordial about it and stopped selling it altogether. I think there might still be another lab selling it, obviously not under that name. And again, there's nothing we can do about that other than stressing the fact that we have this relationship with her, and just by being nice, she wants by virtue of making this strain available to people, to get compensated by royalties through us, and so we have this kind of exclusive relationship. So I think that's kept a lot of people away from making that strain available, just to be nice. I mean, we wouldn't do the same thing if we were on the other side. It's just, but again, that's all just kind of nobody has to abide by that. That's just the way we do it.
Yeah, because I suppose, like, I mean, anyone watching this, like, yeah, the brewing does tend to be people who are the small people, small breweries. They're all working together. Nobody really sees themselves as in competition or trying to close anyone else down. So it's a nice community. So how does it work on just sticking on the Yoviru for a moment? I mean, if I understand right, her yeast it's a mix of strains. Is it the culture
Um,
has multiple strains, or am I wrong? Or
it, it, I mean, it probably depends on maybe which package you get. Like what was sent to us was actually a pure yeast.
okay,
I mean, just given the conditions under which it's used, that might not always be the case. I mean, there was actually lactobacillus in the sample we got, which again is not shocking considering it's a no boil beer, it's an open fermentation. So there was lacto in it, but it was a single strain of yeast.
okay,
Doesn't mean
okay,
it's necessarily always that way, but that's how it arrived to
okay.
us.
I was wondering because I had got in my head somewhere that it was multiple strains, and then I was wondering how you selected them out or what you did to kind of select, but it was pre-selected essentially by
Yeah,
making. Okay,
exactly. So with that, that's true. I mean, we do have that issue with like Norwegian kveik, which are multi-strain blends. So we have to make those considerations with that kind of stuff. But Yoviru was a single strain when it came
and
to
what do you
us.
do with the kvike then? Do you separate out the strains and sell just individual strains, or do you manage to keep the whole culture?
So we do lots of things with those. So the first one we sold, we call Hothead. If you are familiar with the nomenclature of kveik, that's actually the Stranda strain, and at that time, that was actually a single strain from the start. So when that was originally sent to the NCYC in the UK, that was just a single strain. I think a single isolate ended up growing. So it was. I mean, one of the neat things is like every pack of Hothead or that you see out there is a direct relative of that single cell that survived on that plate that was sent to the NCYC. So in that case, nothing to do. It was a single strain, nothing to worry about maintaining any sort of original blend. Voss, on the other hand, we got directly from Lars, and that was two strains. We just selected one. We didn't really see a huge difference between the two. So just in that case, it's just easier to use a single strain pure blend.
Okay.
With Hornindal, that one is a blend of multiple strains that we do our best to maintain the blend as it came to us. So we do some things different with that than we do others. We take a freezer stock and streak it on a plate every time we do the propagation, and then take a large swath off of that to get the culture started, which is not normal microbiology practice where you'd want to start with a single colony so it's clonal. So then we do that every time we start a propagation with Hornindal, so that we hopefully maintain the blend as we received it. From Hornindal, we've actually also isolated a strain. So what we call Lutra is a single strain isolate from the Hornindal blend that has a very kind of neutral profile and wide applicability in styles. So we've kind of done everything with kveik. Maintained cultures. Espa is another good example where we were detecting some phenolic quality from it, which is not expected from kveik yeast, and like actual kveik yeast they're not phenolic. So it seemed like there was probably a straggler in there. So we isolated as many strains as we could, found which one was phenolic, and basically removed that from the blend and reconstituted the blend without the phenolic yeast. What we've done with kveik kind of runs the gamut of microbiology.
And I guess then you see yourself. I mean, you wouldn't do that on it, or would you do that? I mean, just for a purely business reason? Do you do it because you see yourself having like a duty to preserve it, or is there just purely business? It sounds like an awful lot of work for the business side.
Yeah, I mean, it's all of those things, I guess. I think ultimately we're trying to provide a good tool to a brewer for them to be able to make, the beer they're trying to make consistently and with high quality. So in our view, it didn't make business sense necessarily, or even preservation sense to keep Espa in the way we received it, because even in that phenolic quality is not expected in kveik. So I think to be what people would expect from kveik, we needed to cut that, use modern techniques to remove that phenolic yeast. Whereas Hornindal, it was already in good shape, and we didn't need to do that, and so we try to maintain it as a blend, and it's very complex. So we do our best to maintain that, to get as close to an original experience as you can with it. I mean, people are brewing IPAs and stuff with it here, which is not kind of it's how it was originally handled. So I don't know how well that answers your question, but even in we make all these decisions based on getting the brewer the best product.
Okay, so at the end of the day, you're looking at what you're selling the brewer, rather than you don't see yourself as kind of keeping a museum or anything, or some sort of archaeologist. Or
no, and I would argue that has kind of been taken up by the NCYC, and they have a huge library of all these things, and have I think they've done everything too, where they'll take the original culture and kind of freeze it away and make it available that way. But they've also got individual isolates pulled out of some of those too, and they're all frozen away for perpetuity. So we're taking a little more of a curative approach, I guess. So we're not making every blend available, every kveik available, how it was originally formed. It's just not practical for us. So we choose strains based on unique traits, and there's certainly some of them just kind of are duplicative of others. They don't really differentiate themselves over others. So we don't want to just make kveik available for the sake of making kveik available. We want it to be each one to have a kind of unique experience around it.
Right. And do you, like, when you get a new strain like that, how much testing, like making beers yourself, do you do to isolate exactly what it will do in the beer, or do you rely a lot on what you've been told?
No, we do a lot of that. So we have a position here who's our R&D brewer. His job is to make beer. So like generally speaking, our function is to make yeast for brewers, but we have somebody here who makes beer and we're always doing split batch sort of stuff. So we'll make 30 gallons of beer and split it off into 6 5-gallon fermenters, and pitch different yeast or do some variable amongst that those 6 fermenters just to look at this stuff. And so we want to know that we want to be able to explain to brewers what to expect when we put a product out. So we do kind of run it through its paces.
You're not going to set up as a brewery yourself, are you? And have your
No, I mean, we've had talk over the years of doing kind of a tap room sort of thing, where consumers and brewers could come in and have that sort of experience internally. And we were probably thinking about it more around before the pandemic, and then the pandemic obviously changed lots of plans. Like having a tap room focused thing in the midst of a pandemic was, would have been a terrible idea. So, it's been kind of shelved, but we do, customers are invited all the time to come over and kind of taste what we're doing. So we do still have that outreach with breweries. It's just not an open to the public sort of thing.
Right. Okay. No, I just thought it would seem like, a huge, your unique selling point would be quite different from everyone else's in the world,
Yeah. I mean, it might work, I guess, but to some degree, I guess maybe see it as a little bit distraction sort of thing from our primary goal of, research and development and all that.
Yeah, I suppose you're then into competition with everyone else as well, and you're just
and competing with our customers, which
you don't want to be fighting them.
Right.
Yeah. So the kveik, do you see more? I mean, obviously it's relatively new, but what way do you see people using it? I mean, you mentioned there, isolating what people expect from it, but are people using it to brew specific type of beers, or do you think people are using a lot of it just because it's got the temperature and speed and that? Are they trying to replace it just for that fact, or?
Yeah, I think all of those things. So I think some brewers are using it because they can brew really good beer and turn it around quickly. So they've effectively increased their production capacity just by using these yeasts. So there's just, that's just a process argument for incorporating it. But they also tend to be estery, very fruity yeasts, which lends well to what is the dominant style in the US, which is IPA. So those fruity qualities of it work well in those styles. So it's really kind of integrated itself kind of seamlessly into beer culture here because it works in IPAs. To be frank, if it didn't work in IPAs, it wouldn't be popular. I mean, that's just what the beer culture is like here.
Right. Yeah. Well, I mean, I suppose IPAs are everywhere. Though I do. I mean, just talking to various people, I do see more, or maybe it's my perception just because of the people I've been talking to, but I do seem to see a lot more coming in on, yeah, using kind of heritage stuff like yeasts and grains and more organic and local coming into it a lot more. I don't know
Yeah.
if you see that, but then again, maybe you don't see that because you're dealing with the whole country. So
Yeah, and I mean, we see a little bit of that over here, like because there are maltsters kind of popping up, and obviously then hops being grown in places other than the Pacific Northwest, and so there is a drive to that too to try to use local supplies. But it's still they're still trying to use local supplies to make IPAs. Yeah,
yeah, okay, so yeah, okay, well maybe people get around to it. Other
yeah,
styles will come in, like you said, lagers are coming up as well. So
absolutely.
um, yeah, so do you think then? I mean, IPAs are obviously it's all hop forward. Where do you think the yeast like the kveiks and all that you're going with? Yeah, more neutral yeasts are still I think,
Yeah,
not
and
very ones are
yeah, I mean, I think that's where Lutra Kveik kind of makes it does something a little different, where because it is very neutral, it lends itself to what we call pseudo lagers. So we do have customers that use it to make, what they might market as a lager, but it's made with a Norwegian ale yeast, and allows them to again kind of turn it around a little faster with the same high quality that they would have expected from a longer, slower lager fermentation.
right.
So yeah, that strain is used differently, I'd say, than the other kveiks, where people maybe do lean into its neutrality to keep the yeast kind of out of the way and put the focus on the rest of the ingredients.
Um, yeah. So does that mean that? I mean, it's kind of coming back around to the brewery side of thing. Do you see yourself coming up with anything like, or would there be a demand for, say, an Omega house yeast that I suppose Yoviru is kind of that because you have it, but something that you've designed. Would you try and design any yeast cultures that
Yeah,
would be unique
and
to you?
yeah, and we do. And our R&D program, we're actually also into engineering of yeast. So this is where outside of the U.S. You, unless somebody smuggled it in, which we've seen examples of, we can't ship these strains outside the U.S. So we definitely have a lot of R&D focus on creating unique strains. Our first examples were non-phenolic versions of kind of the Ashuf strain. So a Belgian yeast that's phenolic, but also nicely fruity. And we took the Hefeweizen, the traditional German Hefeweizen strain, which is phenolic and a lot of banana esters, and induced the same point mutation in the FDC1 gene, which is responsible for the phenolic quality in Belgian yeast, and basically neutralize that gene. The ale yeast, British ale yeast, kveiks, lager yeast, all have a naturally occurring mutation in that gene, which makes them not phenolic. So we just induced that same mutation in those two strains to create a very new strain. Because when you have that Belgian Alschuf strain, non-phenolic, it totally changes the beer because phenolic is a very dominant aroma. And when you get that out of the way, you start to smell things that you didn't notice were there before. It's really got some very nice fruitiness. And the Hefeweizen strain really leans all in on that banana aroma without the clove that comes along with it. So that's just a very subtle change and inducing a change that's already existing in other brewing yeasts. And what is a very, very simple change just by virtue of us having physically manipulated ourselves, it's unavailable in most of the world because they don't. Most of the world looks at these things as what did you do to it, or no, how did you change it, not what change did you make. Because I mean, in my view, it's absolutely silly that there should be any regulation around inducing a point mutation in FDC1, which is already present in the majority of brewing yeast we use. But that's the state of regulation in a lot of the world.
But if you'd kind of somehow or other bred it to move that, it would have been fine.
Absolutely, and that's one of those other incongruities where you could breed it and find an isolate that's non-phenolic and then back cross it, many times to the parent you want it to be more like. And in theory, you could get to the point where you'd make a strain that's exactly like the one that we CRISPR point mutationed, and you'd get the exact same one that you breed, like exactly the same. The entire genetic sequence is the same. One can be sold in Europe, one cannot, even though they are identical. And that to me is nonsensical.
Yeah. Well, the way you kind of explain it there, it does seem a bit kind of nonsensical, I guess, is the right word. But I suppose it is the way it is. But does that mean? I mean, yeah, like you said, there's been some smuggled in, but I mean, yeah, who's how is anybody going to know? And then you claim you found it in the wild or something.
Yeah, and we can't control. And again, it's like inherently safe. So if somebody brought it in, just started using it, no, and you couldn't even, like, the authorities could sequence every brewery's organism, and it's again not going to look any different. It's not going to look like. So I don't know. A lot of this is kind of just, we're in an awkward period here where regulations didn't even contemplate that this sort of stuff was going to be possible, when the regulations were written. So I do think we'll probably see, and we are seeing in some places, changes in those regulations to reflect this reality that we have tools now that can do what we could do with breeding, but do it more precisely and more quickly. And maybe we need a different regulatory regime for things like that.
In the meantime, we have to assume that Americans will have beers we won't be able to have.
That's pretty much the case right now, yes.
Now you're making me jealous. Sorry, I was going to ask something else there, and I've totally crossed my mind now. Yeah, so that yeast, then you can, again, you can only you come up with a name and a trademark for that, but there is really no control you have over it other than you.
Yeah, so with that's when there's a lot of nuances too. So on when you engineer a strain to have a certain trait, it does become patentable. So in that case, you could file a patent application on the strain that you manipulated and bar other people from making and selling it. But it still has to cross other patentability hurdles. And with the non-phenolic, since the phenolic traits are very well understood and established, you couldn't just do that to a yeast and patent it, because the patent office would tell you it's obvious. So like that change is well understood by people in brewing, and we know the genetic basis, we know how to make that change. So we're not going to give you a patent on something that is obvious, even if it hadn't historically been made. So we didn't file patent applications on those point mutation strains just because we would have had no hope in getting them patented. So yeah, so in those strains, it's certainly possible for others to take them and sell them. Nothing we could do about it. But we are doing some changes that we do think are novel and non-obvious, and file patent applications on those. So it is a tool we'll use. But I mean, our goal is never to restrict what brewers are doing. Like a lot of what brewers have historically shared yeast cultures with each other. And even if we sold a patented yeast strain to one brewery and they shared it with another, we're not going to sue that brewery. That's just kind of within the kind of normal expectations of the brewing community. But what we would, restrict is other yeast labs making and selling those yeasts. So we're only trying to restrict other yeast labs. We're not trying to disrupt the norms of the brewing industry when it comes to sharing yeast.
Right. So that brings around then. So how would you market that? I mean, what's involved in marketing a new yeast to a brewery? I mean, it sounds like it could be an awful lot of education, an awful lot of cost.
Oh, yeah. There's definitely So I mean, some of our newer strains involve thiols, which are a class of compound that evokes a lot of like tropical fruit, passion fruit, grapefruit, things like that. And there are precursors of these thiols that are naturally present in malt, which a lot of people don't think about, and hops also. So there's tons of education that is involved in teaching people how to use these strains and what to expect, because they are really kind of different. I mean, they're putting out huge aromas that you would not expect from normal yeast. And there's all sorts of complex sensory things going on with these thiols in combination with hops. So it's something we're still researching, and aren't at the point where we fully understand all the interactions and sensory of the thiols. So yeah, definitely. We go around to trade shows and talk to people about these. We go to state guild meetings where they're having technical talks and give talks on this stuff. So we spend a lot of time going out and talking to brewers directly about the technology involved, what to expect, and how to use them.
And is that something you thought you'd be doing when you set up the company?
Probably not. Not to this. Not to this level. But I mean, it serves. It's great marketing too. I mean, to get in front of brewers and talk about the things we're doing, and to talk. I think a lot of brewers are just inherently interested in the science of beer, and love to see this stuff and to talk about this stuff and to put their own twists on it. I mean, we have this pilot brew system, but we can't brew every single variable. Brewers come up with things that we weren't even thinking about. So it's, it really gets their wheels turning and experimentation going, and it's just exciting for everybody.
Yeah, I think anybody who knows a brewer will say, yeah, I mean, most of the styles they come up with, they're doing it for their own interest and then hope that there's a market in many cases. Otherwise, they're all stuck with the lagers in day one,
Right.
It's been very interesting. I mean, I have absolutely no idea how this worked. Well, so you were saying in America there's not too many, that there's only a handful of yeast labs. I don't know what there is in the rest of the world. Do you have a clue for what's out in the rest of the world, or?
I mean, there's stuff popping up every once in a while. I mean, like we've seen some kind of startups in the UK. There's like 2 in Australia that we've seen that have started recently, which the sheer numbers are in the US. We've got like 9,000 breweries, which is a lot of potential customers for the number of yeast labs we have here. Whereas Australia, I think, is somewhere in the 500 to 800 breweries, which so they're fighting over fewer breweries. Those 2 have a fewer breweries per yeast lab. No, more breweries. Fewer breweries per yeast lab than we have in the U.S. So it's just very different, and the culture, the yeast culture is different around the world. Just because we've had liquid yeast available in the U.S. for a long time, that's kind of integrated itself into the craft brewing culture, and that's the rest of the world. Just because they haven't had that, have relied more on dry yeast, which have some shelf stability advantages and things like that. That they're some of these places I think are going to have to overcome just kind of the way things have been done for a long time. Like the liquid yeast is more expensive. That's just unavoidable. So they're going to have to kind of change that culture.
So is it a business of, it needs scale, I think is what you're.
Yeah, and we, yes, and we started on a small scale and have grown to a larger and larger scale, and have now some advantages of a larger scale. And yeah, so maybe they'll find that niche and grow that market gradually, but it's going to be a tougher slog, I think.
And at this case, well, I suppose that there are a couple of advantages. Like if you're closer to the brewers in Australia, then you're doing what you were saying there, the education. You can get out and talk to them, so you can get a market out of it. But
yeah, and logistics are, I mean, like shipping has gotten so we were, I think, making some headway in Australia, and it's hard to maintain that just because with the pandemic and the effect on shipping, and then the war in Ukraine and effect that's had on, like, it's just wildly expensive to even just get our product to Australia. And then the strength of the US dollar versus every, a lot of other currencies making things. It's just international's tough right now because of all those headwinds.
Right. Yeah. So if anybody's watching, there is maybe for a limited time a bit of a niche you can get into before everyone else does. All right. Well, I don't know. I'm sure you're probably very busy. I mean, it's early morning. You're only starting your work day there. So I don't know if there was. I have pretty much I had no idea coming in to talk to you how the business worked or how you manage that. So it's been brilliant learning from you. I'll let you go because you're busy. But is there anything I should have asked you that you think, God, why didn't he ask me this?
No, I would just say if you do have folks watching that are just interested in the science of beer, I'd say just pay attention to the stuff that we put on our website, our social media, and all that stuff, because we do share the science we're working on. So we do just kind of straight research into haze, like what is the molecular basis of haze and hazy IPA. We do research on these types of things and share it with people. So you can find tips by just following us on improving certain aspects of your beer. Right. So just
yeah, because that's maybe something nobody or not many people think of is that you're doing all this research on beers and stuff as well. It's not just producing the same yeast over and over. Like you said, you're doing molecular and genetic kind of experimentation and testing and all of that. So there's I took a look at the website. There's a huge amount of information there. I should have mentioned that. So if anybody wanted, it's omegayeast.com, isn't it?
That's correct.
Okay. Well, I'd encourage anyone there to go and check it out, because there is a lot of information, a lot of stuff. You're doing a lot of exciting stuff as well, like you said, with things that maybe people aren't considering. So listen, Lance, that was brilliant. I don't have any other questions. I wish I did, but I think you just kind of flooded my mind. So I'll probably come up with about 20 more later when you're gone. But I guess it's coming up towards 10 o'clock. I better let you get back to work, I suppose.
Sounds good. We'll talk some other time in the future.
Okay, perfect. I'm just going to play out another video there just to kind of close it all off, if that's okay. And
sure.
Thanks again. It was a pleasure, and hopefully we'll get this up on YouTube and stuff, and people can catch the replay.
Sounds good.
All right. Thanks a million.
Yep. Thank you. Thank you for the invitation.